the whole focus of Matthew was heavily involved in the housing issue. Housing, when I worked in housing division in the 1970s, there was two public expenditure priorities. One was security, and secondly was housing. Housing got more money in the 1970s than any other element. Health, education were down the list of priorities. The priority was housing. And so the whole issue of Leganside and city centre and renovation, that didn't start to come in until the 1970s, really.
The actual Matthew report itself boils down to 6 points. The first one was the stop line, which was utterly critical to the whole philosophy and thinking behind it. It was the first time there was going to be a line drawn around the city. The second one was the fact that there was going to be a new city created as a counter-magnet to the influx of population. That was the raison d'etre in a way for the thinking behind the plan. The third one was the growth towns, which basically had the idea of that's where the people would live and take the pressure off Belfast. And the last three were interesting ones. But first of all, there was the protection of the countryside and coast, which Matthew was very strong about and really encouraged the protection, which remains right through to today. I mean, the whole question of what we now call Greenbelt and things like that was stemmed from that. Then it was the decision that Robert Matthew inspired, which was a single planning authority for the region. I mean, that had been advocated in the 1940s, in fact, but it hadn't come to pass, but Matthew gave credence for it. And the final thing, Dick, you'd remember this.
Oh, yeah.
Compensation for the refusal of permission to build.
In terms of legislation, the first piece of legislation that came in the statute book was the Land Compensation Act of '65. The following year, you had the Amenity Lands Act, which enabled national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty and nature reserves to be established. That all came from a Divis report of the 1940s. Well, all the stuff about the countryside that was incorporated in the Matthew plan was based on the stuff of the Planning Advisory Board about 1947. And then that eventually became the Amenity Lands Act of 1966.
The famous Travers Morgan report, which occurred in the 60s and through what people have disparagingly described as spaghetti over the city in terms of high-level motorway. But all of that thinking was there in the 40s as well, and traffic was going to be the big issue, big build stuff. There was almost a smooth transition in the 40s through the Matthew plan to the Travers Morgan plan, all consistent in their thinking. There's also as a result of the bombing in 1941, there was a huge space in High Street. It was almost as if the concept was to bring a dual carriageway from the Shankill ultimately right into the heart of the city. And the first bit that we were going to build was where it had been bombed and cleared, and so that's why we've got this dual carriageway in Bridge Street.
Up until 1965, if you were refused planning permission, you were entitled to compensation for the value of the land for the proposed use. So you might have a field which is worth maybe £1,000 an acre for farming, but if you were refused planning permission to use that for housing, you were paid compensation of the housing value. That there meant that the councils were very, very scared of refusing planning permission. And this came to a head at Shaw's Bridge, where the Down County Council were the planning authority. And they got a massive planning application to build a major new housing development at Shaw's Bridge. And the council wanted to refuse it, but they couldn't afford to refuse it planning permission because it was going to cost so much in compensation. John Oliver stepped in at that time, having spoken to Matthew about it, and he persuaded the minister, who was a man called Willie Morgan at that time, to pay the compensation liabilities of all the planning authorities. So in early 1960s, the compensation liabilities of all planning authorities was taken over by the government, which meant that for the first time they could refuse planning permission without the worry of having to pay the compensation for it. And so they refused the planning permission for Shaw's Bridge, and you now know Shaw's Bridge is the Lagan Valley Regional Park. If John Oliver had one thing in his tombstone, it would be he saved Shaw's Bridge for the people of Belfast. But compensation was the biggest element of allowing planning to take decisions on planning grounds and not to be worried about the compensation costs. The stop line was imposed immediately on the 26th of February 1963. It was imposed and it was sacrosanct to the extent that where planning permissions existed outside the stop line, they were revoked right round the stop line, which was tight in on the existing built-up area, and all those planning permissions were revoked and compensation was paid by the government. And see, of course, the minute you put the stop line round Belfast, you then had an overspill problem. And the Matthew thesis was it would go to the new city in Craigavon, it would go to the growth towns which were Bangor, Antrim, Ballymena and Newtonards. And the interesting thing that happened was that the private sector overspill of its own volition almost went to Bangor and to Newtonards. And so in the 1960s they started to prepare town plans. But the interesting thing is that a lot of people, and friends of mine, my age, emigrated, in quotes, to Bangor, and so you had a lot of private sector development in Bangor.
There was a bit of an outcry, quite a serious outcry about the Matthew Plan being restricted to, east of the Ban.
Yeah.
The other parts of Northern Ireland felt, rightly I suppose, that they were denied something that was happening, and the focus of attention and expenditure was all on the east side.
I mean, one of the big issues was in 1964 when they announced the site of the new university at Craigavon instead of Derry. If you want to think of some of the reasons why there was the civil rights movement, one element of that was the location of the university in Craigavon, and there was a lot of dispute about that at the time. It eventually led to this part of the civil rights movement, and of course the response of government was to set up the Londonderry Development Commission, which was the first time that planning had come into Derry in a big way. In 1969, New Barnsley Housing Estate, which is just across the road from Ballymurphy, it was a mixed estate. The minute that the troubles broke out in 1969, the whole of New Barnsley Estate became Catholic, and the Protestants moved out, and so you've got peace walls, segregated housing, all over West Belfast and parts of East Belfast. I mean, we didn't have that segregation of housing in the 1960s.
Somebody said there was something like 70,000 people in the 1970s were forced to move or opted to move under pressure, if you like.
The movement of people after the outbreak of the Troubles in 1969 was the biggest movement of population since the war. The minute the Matthew report was published, John Oliver started the recruitment process for the staff of the new city design team. I was sent down to Lurgan in 1963, and Matthew was published in 1963. And they put out one big vesting order. They vested all the land by compulsion.
6,000 acres.
6,000 acres.
I mean, it's mind-blowing when you think of the...
There was a complete branch of the civil service did nothing but buy that land.
Oh, I know. It lasted, I'm sure, the whole process about 10 years. Some guys held out for the big money, as they thought at the end. In the end, they got, I think it was the value of money had gone up so much that nothing moved in terms of what they were entitled to. Most of the architects that were brought over from England came from Scotland, actually. And they were mostly Cumbernauld people that had worked there. These guys were bringing Cumbernauld to Belfast, parts of the North Van. One time, believe it or not, the chief architect planner for Craigavon proposed that the whole centre of Craigavon should be one grand building. Geoffrey
Copcott, he was the first chief planner, and he wanted to build a single building, cantilevered, looking down the road.
I remember a student trip to Cumbernauld and meeting him for the first time. He sat at the top of a long desk with a huge check suit and the Santa Claus beard or whatever. He was just a crazy guy, but of course we all thought he was wonderful because he was so inspirational with his thinking, you know.
There was two reasons why he resigned. One was he took up the cudgels of Derry and said that the Matthew Plan was seriously flawed because it didn't take enough account of Derry, and he did a big article for the Belfast newsletter, and I mean, he didn't seek any permissions, and he was getting heavily involved in a major political issue, and Dr. Oliver had him up and he wouldn't apologise. He either resigned or he was asked to go.
But most people who live in Craigavon really like it. It's a popular place to live. But it just the concept of social housing really didn't succeed and was just doomed to failure from the outset.
We had the Craigavon Development Commission, which was established to look after Craigavon, and this was a unitary organisation dealing with everything in Craigavon. In 1972, there was the reorganisation of local government. The councils typically were there to bury the dead and empty the bins, that's what people said. So you had this Craigavon council, and you had all sorts of crazy little things, like who was going to be responsible for cutting the grass? Was it going to be the road service because it was beside a road? Was it going to be the housing executive because it was in a housing executive estate? Was it going to be the department? Was it going to be
the council?
And you started getting difficult to let estates, is what they call them. And they emerged in Craigavon, and they emerged in Antrim, and they emerged in Ballymena. And the people just did not want to go to those areas. Some of the social problems we have today are in those very areas, still there. And yet they were built as the dream area, plenty of open space, lungs for the children to play in, bicycle ways, footpaths.
You're dealing with a time in the 60s, that's the masterplan, when things were influenced by Corbusier and so on. And I was trained as an architect, and I remember being dispatched over to Sheffield to look at the wonders of the Park Hall scheme there and walk along the deck access and wow, isn't this wonderful, streets in the sky? And it was all to do with the belief that everybody, all friends, neighbours were working together. Of course that wasn't the case. And we ended up, fortunately, only having Divis, but it didn't last long, it was knocked down. That was the thinking, and it was all this idea of thinking fairly big. And to that extent, you know, I would say Matthew was a component of his time.
The Skeffington report was about 1968 or 67, and Skeffington was the first sort of major realisation that you really did have to start consulting with people. And I think it was the Planning Act of 1968 in England, which brought in the whole notion of public participation in plan making. But by 1968, a lot of these decisions on slum clearance and on a major motorway system for Belfast had already been taken. Skeffington was too late for all that. And I say the Shankle campaign was also too late, it had already happened.
There was not an awareness. Certainly in the 60s, the focus was on top-down development. This is the best way to do it from the point of view of the economy, you know, and there really wasn't this sort of care and concern for the consequences of that. Although I would just add that I think, as far as the West Link concerned, a lot of the damage had already been done by the slum clearance. I think, for example, the West Link was a logical progression of the thinking that had started in the 40s about trying to get traffic through, particularly to the docks. And it happened to be through land that was in large part already cleared for the slum clearance, because the initiative was taken by the City Council to clear the land. It was, the hesitation was in what to replace it with, and that was all coupled with delays that were associated with the masterplan and the implementation of it.
If you take the West Link, remember the West Link originally was to be an elevated motorway, and the local people on the west of the city said, we do not want cars travelling past our bedroom windows. That's why it was sunk down. It was because of the public pressure from the residents. And of course, the other argument about the elevated roadways was that it devastated Sailortown. And Sailortown has gone. The Shankle Road, the way in which slum clearance was addressed was basically a flat earth policy. And so what people were saying was, if we knock down those slums, which have got a very high density, where are the people going to go? They're going to go to Craigavon, they're going to go to Antrim, they're going to go to Ballymena, and we'll build brand new housing estates and give people the money, a grant to go out there. But what happened in the Shankill particularly was that it devastated the whole social structure. If you look at the Shankill today, I mean, it's still a dreadful place. And so the people like Jackie Redpath, he started the Save the Shankill campaign, but it was too late. The Shankill had already gone. All those people from the Shankill Road left and will not come back. Because the Shankill people today are saying, build us houses, look at all this empty space in the Shankill. But people won't come back. They won't come back from Ballyduff. They won't come back from Rathcoole. They're quite happy to be out there and not to come back to the Shankill Road.
I mean, there's no doubt that the movements that began in the 70s with Jackie Redpath translated themselves into whose city is it anyway. We're all based on the premise that somebody up there who described himself as a planner had a master plan that was doing all this damage without any care or concern. It wasn't really like that. There was a lack of awareness, maybe. And I think we were all maybe guilty of that. We weren't sensitive until Skeffington came along and they were obliged to take account of public participation. But until that time, Radburn was an architectural concept that actually was felt to be by architects, and those of us working at it in the 70s, we'd reached the point of realizing it was mistaken. But I mean, you'd almost literally be divided between a pathway for the cars, a pathway for cyclists, a pathway for pedestrians, a pathway to walk your dog. It was totally turned on its head, partly thanks to the work of Charlie Brett and the architects like Bob Strang, who was working with him at the time. In the inner city, when it came to it, went to the other extreme of having shared surfaces and short cul-de-sacs, which was the total opposite to what had been the case in Craigavon. And it was architectural thinking this, but of course it was picked up as, that's the military are influencing that because they're trying to sort of make sure there's no escape from these short cul-de-sacs. But the truth was, it was road service were saying, if you want a shared service, it must be for a short distance and there must be no way out of it. And then you were driving slowly and therefore safely. Part of the same myth that I believe that has gone about since the 70s, that this was all of intent, deliberately to try to contain and to disregard maybe the community spirit or maybe to divide the community along sectarian lines. It wasn't that at all. These things are accidents of history rather than somehow predetermined by some master plan. Planning is never about a blueprint like an architect's drawing and that this is the way it's to be built and let's persist. Change is necessary to cope with changing economic circumstances. I think Matthew was a child of his time, if you like. That was what was happening in the 60s. There was a head of steam, and that head of steam wasn't there a decade later.
It was fundamental to everything that happened in terms of legislation and administration. Setting up a single planning authority happened in 1972.
But in 1996, before the Good Friday Agreement, that was a high spot in the planning of the city because all the agencies that deliver development were all brought under one roof. They were all within what was then the Department of the Environment, Roads, Housing, Planning, Water and Sewage. And Dick was one of the undersecretaries at that stage. He was commissioned and asked to organise the thinking towards producing another Matthew plan, if you like, towards the millennium. And the famous phrase that you coined, Dick, was beyond land use planning. Because the whole realisation was that for planning to have any meaning, it was going to have to be something that belonged to the community rather than purely a regulatory tool for development control. As far as Belfast is concerned, I never felt that there was some sort of master plan or a blueprint that we were trying to fulfill. So I don't think the legacy is there in terms of the actual planning of the city.
It's hard to just say definitely it was a success or definitely it was a failure. There was a lot of good things happened as a result of Matthew. There's a lot of very disappointing things that happened as a result of the Matthew. I think the basic misunderstanding was overspill. The overspill from Belfast went to Newtonabbey and to Castlereagh and to Bangor. And so the forced overspill, as it were, to Craigavon and to Antrim, we still have the legacy of social problems as a result of that. The business of projections, population household projections, I don't think that we got it quite right in the early 1960s.
I mean, it's maybe a bit arrogant of me to say that Robert Matthew misunderstood the problem, but this concept that somehow Belfast was such a magnet that was drawing people from the countryside, actually what was really happening was a process that had begun almost in the 19th century, where the drift towards the city began like as an inward one and into the heart of the city and then spilling out. So the pressure in the suburbs was not people from the countryside looking for houses, it was people who had the wherewithal at that stage in the 50s and 60s and their post-war years to maybe build in better circumstances into the countryside. So there was, if you like, the premise on which the Matthew Plan was based was flawed in that sense, because ultimately it was never really going to succeed in terms of a new city that would capture people en route to the city.